Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Cervantes, and I'm going to be presenting on the book called Another Country by James Baldwin. So, a little bit of background about James Baldwin is he was born in 1924 in Harlem, New York, to a single mother. He was actually one of nine siblings. They were widely spread out. They drastically varied in age. The last one was born after he graduated high school in 1942. And he was also the grandson of or to a slave as well. So during high school, he attended a predominantly white as well as Jewish high school where he kind of explored himself there. He ended up working a job at the school's magazine. He published a few, just like short stories there. And he also explored his sexuality. So he was very open about his homosexuality, and he didn't feel like rigid labels. He didn't really like rigid labels because they limited his freedom. So he, wrote novels that had, gay men in there and had stretched the limits of sexuality standards at the time, especially back then. And so he sought refuge from alienation about his sexuality through religion, which sounds kind of contradictory depending on which religion you go for. But he, the one he did primarily, it wasn't a big fan of it. But he ended up becoming a preacher for the Pentecostal faith. And he landed a fellowship in 1945, which pretty much began his career and where he started actually creating novels. So his first novel was a semi-autobiography titled Go Tell It on the Mountain. And it was published in 1953. And so the most notable piece that he made was called The Fire Next Time. And it primarily focused on racial injustice going on at the time. And he also moved to France to escape, the binding restraints that were placed in America regarding racism and homosexuality at the time. Uh, and he ended up going back and forth between Paris and the US quite frequently. So he didn't really have one specific home. He went back and forth for work and various reasons. And a fun fact is he preferred to write longhand on paper, so on legal pad rather than typewriter at the time, which typewriters was the most common way to, people wrote things back then. So it's kind of interesting that, the writer kind of felt more connected to his piece by actually writing it. And so the associated source is actually that I chose is called Another Country, Another Time. And so I've chosen to focus on a few key points here. It was written by a man named Fred Standley in 1972, and it highlights the controversy this novel created. Because some say, it's a sexual free-for-all, while others call it the most powerful novels of our time. So it's very widely disputed and loved by certain people. So it was ridiculed a lot for its lack of. Some people believe it had a lack of like a concrete plot and almost acted as somewhat of a sexual fantasy, and people actually try to remove it from reading lists in school. Some acknowledge its message regarding sexuality and race. Uh, and others, focus on the actual plot of it. So, although the novel is centered around the death of Rufus, various narratives intertwine to explore the various interracial, intersexual relationships. That's what the paper primarily focuses on. Furthermore, there's a detailed description of the space and environment of New York City, which illuminates the brutal conditions and struggles one has to endure. And a quote that, from the paper that I liked was, "In order to not perish of loneliness." So he kind of pretty much, sets up this context for this kind of environment that's going on there. Um, but yeah, so others there's in this paper he kind of goes from he takes notes from other writers who kind of critique the book, and there's one that I like that focus on the narrative of Vivaldo and Ida as a key, as they are one of the few people to play a key role in all three sections of the book. Rufus is a lot of the book is about Rufus, but he doesn't come up in every section of the book, and he dies early on. And so it kind of sheds light for me on why the so-called main character was killed early on in the novel, because although his death, or not killed, but committed suicide, but because although his death caused a cascade of events with multiple affairs, relationships, Rufus's inability to find peace from his internalized pain leading to his death isn't the primary goal to point across, but rather the struggle of dealing with, the unknown of sexuality and racial identities. Uh, Stanley exclaims that the physical environment mirrors the people's spirit and how it symbolizes the character's feeling of entrapment and loneliness. Um, and, he finishes it off by stating how other novels shy away from these topics. And then, one of the reasons this novel, that Stanley liked this novel, is because it took direct approach to addressing the intricacies of taboo subjects regarding society and culture. So that's something I really liked about the associated source. And then for the excerpt that I chose, I'll go ahead and read it. He lit a cigarette and stood in the vestibule while the hideous outskirts of Paris rolled by. Why am I going home? He asked himself. But he knew why. It was time. In order not to lose all that he had gained, he had to move forward and risk it all. And so one of the reasons I really like this quote is it kind of spoke to me as sometimes you have to persevere and go through the trials and troubles to come out a better person. Um, and this is evident as he maintains in being one of this is you know Ida and Vivaldo are in one of the most stable relationships uh, you know that there is. And so it shows strength and courage in Eric as he is voluntarily doing this, despite being on a Broadway show. So Eric is the one saying this, despite being on a Broadway show, he's still voluntarily doing this. So he's allowed himself to tackle head on the oppression he felt to reconnect with former friends and lovers and search for the connection that, he so desires. So that's the excerpt that I chose and, kind of the reason why it kind of spoke to me. And so the discussion questions I chose are on page 229, immediately after Eric leaves Paris to move to New York, Baldwin details the location as having no sense whatever of the exigencies of human life. Now, what purpose and effect does the author intend to convey about Eric as a person and his sense of belonging? And then some background info is Baldwin further asks this by stating one was continually being jostled, yet longed at the same time for the sense of others. And if one was never left alone in New York, one still had to fight, or one had to still fight very hard in order to not perish of loneliness. And then on page 272, Cass opens up to Vivaldo about her struggle with her identity and her marriage by stating that he doesn't see me anymore. He doesn't see me. He hasn't touched me. So, how does Baldwin use Cass's internal struggles to bring to light and critique traditional gender roles in this time period? And then the last discussion question is on the last page of the book, the novel ends on an uplifting note about Yves and Eric stating that all his fear left him. He was certain now that everything would be all right. So, what message does Baldwin wish to impose on the readers by contrasting the dark beginning of the book, which focuses on Rufus' struggle with racism identity, with a more lighthearted hope that Yves and Eric's blooming really, lighthearted hope of Yves and Eric's blooming relationship. And then lastly, the works cited page. But thank you.